Hi, I'm Seakga Tladi. This is African Disclosure, and this is what our program is going to look like today. So, on the show today, we're going to be unpacking quite a few stories. We've got quite a full show for you. It's jam-packed. And these are some stories shaping Africa's political, economic, and social future. And each story sort of reveals a continent, an African continent, a South Africa, a Southern Africa that is grappling with sovereignty, self-reliance, and institutional transformation in different ways. So we're going to start right here in South Africa, where a controversial activist, anti-Western activist, mind you, Kemi Seba, he appears in court and he has been appearing in court for his very crucial bail hearing. We've been covering this case since the very beginning, and today we are going to be talking to one of our very senior journalists here in South Africa and a proud correspondent for our show. We're going to be speaking to Thabo Makwakwa. He has been at the trial. He has been in court every single day, so he's going to kind of catch us up as to what's happening, and we'll find out whether or not Mr. Seba receives bail. And then we're going to shift our focus to Zimbabwe, where Harare has announced plans to return 67 European-owned farms that were seized during the fast-track land reform program. And Zimbabwe is also announcing that they're going to pay many millions of dollars in compensations to foreign landowners. And all of this is because bilateral investment treaties that Zimbabwe has now signed into. This is, for me, when I think about the story, and as I was thinking about it today, this is a very emotionally charged economic story in Southern Africa. Because land in Zimbabwe has never been a simple affair. Land in Southern Africa is not a simple affair. Even here in South Africa, we're still having many conversations about land. But now it seems like Zimbabwe has decided to take the step of returning some of the land that had been taken back by black subsistence farmers during the 2000s. And we're going to be unpacking this decision, and right there we're going to be speaking to an economist, Malone Gwadu, about what all of this means for Zimbabwe and how he is thinking about it. It certainly seems like, at least according to Malone Gwadu, that this is a positive move for Zimbabwe. And then we're going to be speaking about International Nurses Day, and particularly we're going to be speaking about these nurse-led clinics that are popping up all over South Africa that are being supported by Riser Ventures. And basically, these are called empathy clinics, and they're creating a new model of community healthcare, one that empowers nurses as entrepreneurs while also reducing the load on South Africa's overstretched and overburdened medical systems. Could these township clinics help to transform healthcare access for millions of South Africans? That's the question we're going to be confronting there. And there we're going to be talking to Linda Dunkley. She is one of the people in charge there at Riser Ventures that is supporting these empathy clinics. And we're going to be discussing this development with her. And then finally, we're going to zoom out all the way out to the regional economy. One of our proud correspondents on the show, Peter Grill, managed to organize an interview with Ashraf Patel from the Institute of Global Dialogue. And the conversation they had was about whether South Africa can use the momentum of its G20 presidency to push for deeper industrial coordination, stronger regional supply chains, and more self-reliant Southern African economies. So from courtrooms to clinics, from land reform to regional trade, this is everything we're going to be getting into on the show today. So you do want to stick around. My name is Seakga Tladi. This is African Disclosure. Let's get it going. Right, so let's get started. Like I said, we're going to get started right here in South Africa with a case that is officially becoming much bigger than just a routine immigration case. And we've spoken about this a lot before. This case sits at the intersection of law, diplomacy, asylum policy, regional security. There's a lot of interconnected themes that we can discuss when we talk about the story. And it is about the Beninese activist, Kemi Seba. He has appeared in court in Pretoria for a crucial bail hearing alongside his co-accused. Now, this, on the one hand, it's an immigration matter involving visa violations. And on the other hand, it's also a much larger geopolitical story that involves South Africa, Benin, Niger, France, and, even broader debates about, Russian participation and influence in Africa through voices like this. So, I guess first and foremost, we just need to find out whether Mr. Seba is being granted bail. The short answer to that is no, he hasn't been granted bail. But we're also going to be talking a little bit about what it is like on the ground at the court. So let's get into it. I want to start off with a conversation that I had with a producer of the show, someone who works very hard behind the scenes to make sure that we can give you this show. And he's been attending the court hearings every single week. Every single time Mr. Seba has gone to court, he was there. So let's go to our correspondent, Thabo Makwakwa. We've had a short conversation with him about some of the developments of the trial, and there's also a very interesting dynamic here. Mr. Seba has been represented by different lawyers, I believe, every single time he's gone to court. So I also want to hear from Thabo, what's going on? Why are the lawyers changing? So please help me welcome onto the show someone you've heard from before because he is one of our correspondents, but someone who works very hard behind the scenes. Help me welcome Mr. Thabo Makwakwa. I'm about to introduce someone whom you've heard on the show before. You've heard his voice, and he is one of the very, very big team that is keeping things going for us. One of the very important people that helps us to put this together. None other than Mr. Thabo Makwakwa, a seasoned South African journalist and now one of our producers on the show. Welcome. What does it feel like to be on the show for the first time? You're normally behind the scenes.
No, thank you so much, Seakga, for having me. It feels great being here, and I could just simply say it feels great simply because I'm the one always putting up together this show, making sure we've got at least guests, have speakers to come and entertain us here. So it feels a little bit different. And of course, me being on the hot seat, I do not know what questions you're going to ask, but I look forward to it. Thank you so much for having me once again.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about Kemi Seba because you're one of the journalists who's been at the trial almost every single day that there has been a trial. And obviously there was a bail hearing today. And I wanted to bring you on to just give us a little bit of an update about what is going on with the Kemi Seba case. So for those who don't know, what's happened here is that Kemi Seba is a very, very controversial anti-Western activist. And he was arrested in South Africa on his way to Zimbabwe. They say he was making his way to Europe, and he is wanted in France as well as in Benin. And he's wanted in Benin for helping to incite violence, and they want his extradition back. And his case is being heard in South Africa. Now, in South Africa, he is being charged with contravening our Immigration Act and I think overstaying a 3-month visa. He was arrested with a gentleman who was accused of helping them to sneak across the border. I can't recall his name.
Yeah, apparently, I'm not sure if I will be correct, but he's called Mr. Van der Merwe.
Yes.
If not mistaken, yes.
Yes, and then he's also arrested with his son.
Alongside his son, yeah.
So that's the update. So first and foremost, I wanted to ask, you've been to the court a few times now. What is the feeling in the court? Is the court full? Does it seem like people are very much concerned with this case? And can you just put us into the situation of what it's like to be there on the days of these trials?
Okay, so there is public interest when it comes to this case. You would recall that now, for the third time, the case has actually been remanded, and this was because there has to be further investigations conducted, and that includes the verification of his address where he'll be residing, as he will be expected to be attending the court case. But that is just speaking about the bail application, which was brought forward by the attorneys for Mr. Kemi Seba, who actually argued that Mr. Kemi Seba, yes, was arrested here in South Africa, if not mistaken, on the 13th of February this year. This is after news had broken out in Benin that there were attempts of, a coup to unseat the current leader of that nation. And this happens with him here while here in South Africa, where he was joined by his son, of course, who came to visit him. But according to the National Prosecuting Authority, which was arguing earlier on, they are saying that Mr. van der Merwe has got links with, other people who were assisting them to actually evade South Africa because of this imminent arrest at the time. And therefore, they were actually stopped at the borders when they were trying to cross over to South Africa. But at the bail hearing, we have heard from Mr. Bill Cobras, who is the new attorney for Mr. Kemi Seba. He argued that Mr. Kemi Seba was to actually apply for an asylum here in South Africa simply because in the nation where he comes from, which is Benin, he is actually wanted by the authorities in that nation for, of course, his work. You would know that his organization runs these anti-Western programs, of course, and his lawyer, Mr. Cobras, was even arguing during the bail hearing that this organization has been targeted by the Benin government and, of course, France, because France has to, is trying to at least instill this colonial influence on the nation. And Mr. Kemi Seba, who actually wanted to contest for the elections and was against that, is the reason why he finds himself in this particular situation today. But we also discovered during the proceedings that the Niger government has actually given him the diplomatic status, as he was apparently appointed by the president of Niger as special advisor to the president, meaning that if he is to stay here in South Africa, the embassy of Niger has to make sure that wherever he resides is at the places known by the embassy, or at least at the embassy, since he will be attending this court case here. But that is just to give you the fast forward at least proceedings of what unfolded in court. On the 19th of May, which is next week, the magistrate in Patlele has ordered that the court goes back again to actually not deliberate on this matter, but to provide an outcome on the bail application, which was brought forward by Mr. Kemi Seba's defense, while the National Prosecuting Authority, of course, is against Mr. Seba and his two co-accused, one being Mr. van der Merwe and his son, citing that they might evade justice. Yeah, I think for now, I'll just pause there.
I want to talk about the lawyer thing actually quickly, because I remember when you went to the court for the first time, there was a different lawyer. What was the first lawyer's name again?
It was I can't recall the name exactly, but it was Pasha or Pasha, something like that.
Yes. We'll find that name now.
Yes.
And then now there's another lawyer, Mr. Cobras.
Yes.
What happened there?
All right. So the first time we attended the court hearing in Pretoria Regional Court, there was, of course, the initial lawyer whom you were referring to just now. I may have forgotten his name for now, but I'll quickly get it. He represented him, but the matter was of course remanded because the investigators wanted to proceed with the investigations, conducting whatever investigations that they needed in order to at least provide enough evidence for the matter to proceed in court. So when I returned again the second time at the last appearance of Mr. Kemi Seba, we were informed by now his new attorney that there's a new attorney on record as the other one is no longer available, but they did not provide reasons as to why. And then again today at this appearance, we discovered that there's actually a new attorney, Mr. Bill Cobras.
So this is the third attorney.
So this is the third attorney in the third appearance.
Wow.
Yeah, he's made.
Yeah, I guess that's the little bit of a curious part. I just looked up the name of the first lawyer. His name was Sesedi Poko.
Oh, yes, Mr.
And
Sesedi.
then there was a second one, and now there's a third lawyer as well. So I guess that's one of the things that we'll be looking out for as we go to court again. And you said that that is going to be?
Next week on Tuesday, the 19th. So this will be to determine whether they're going to be granted bail or not.
So I guess next week we'll be able to inform our listeners about the final outcome of the bail hearing before we go to trial. And hopefully we will have our producer back on the show to speak about what you see as you go to court next week. But for today, thank you so much for joining me. And I know we'll have you on again to speak about this next week.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So let's get into it. We have just listened to Thabo Makwakwa filling us in on what's been happening at court. And look, the basics are there. There's not really that much new developments to give you. So let's just talk about what has happened. What we know is that there was an attempted coup in Benin and the coup failed. And then Benin accused Seba of encouraging the uprising and issued a warrant of arrest against him. And then Seba has been found in South Africa. He was leaving South Africa along with his son and a young or a man that they paid to have them transported across the border. And they were caught, and now they're in jail. And they're facing charges of immigration violations and also overstaying the visa, right? So that is the broad context that we are in. But this also kind of places South Africa in a weird diplomatic position, right? Because does South Africa cooperate with Benin's extradition request? Or does South Africa prioritize the asylum protections? Mr. Seba has said that he fears for his life should he be returned to Benin. So that brings up the asylum argument, right? This may ultimately become one of the most important parts of the entire case, because if he fears for his life, then, well, I mean, South African law, according to my very mediocre understanding of South African law, it dictates that, well, he must be protected. His legal team has told the court that he has not returned to Benin since May 2024, and that's because he believes he could be persecuted. So that changes a lot, right? He also confirmed that he filed an asylum application with South Africa's Department of Home Affairs on April 28th, and that changes a lot because South African law and international refugee protections, under those frameworks, deporting someone who claims political persecution could follow them, that becomes very, very complicated. So now South Africa needs to determine, is he a political dissident or is he someone attempting to evade accountability for these very serious allegations that he's facing? And that's a distinction that matters, which is why South Africa has to proceed very, very carefully, right? If South Africa fast tracks the extradition, critics may accuse South Africa of abandoning someone who is making the charge of political persecution. And, you know, if we grant him bail and we allow him to stay in the country, it doesn't mean that he walks free permanently, right? It simply means that the court believes that he can wait further legal proceedings outside of detention. And they would put certain conditions on him. So this means travel restrictions, surrendering his passports, regular reporting to authorities. That's what would happen if he is granted the bail and he is protected as someone who is seeking asylum. But obviously the state would raise the idea that no, he shouldn't be granted asylum because he's already tried to evade South Africa in a nefarious way. So it's a very complicated case. And Niger has also positioned itself within this as, part of an anti-Western political bloc that is emerging in the Sahel. And they are saying that they will provide him with accommodation while he resides in South Africa awaiting trial. So, you know what? We don't know what is going to happen next in the Seba case. The next court date is going to be on the 19th, that is next week, and we will have Thabo Makwakwa back onto the show explaining what will happen in court that day. But for now, I want to go to one more interview to just tie together this whole matter of Kemi Seba. So let's go to an interview with his lawyer that was representing him today.
My name is Bill Cobras. I'm the attorney for Kemi Seba. Today it was the continuation of the bail proceedings for Kemi Seba and his co-accused. So what we've presented today in court is an affidavit signed by him motivating for his release on bail. So the case is postponed until next week, Tuesday, for closing arguments as well as for the decision of the court.
Do we know, does this mean that in the Tuesday we'll be having a decision, or you still be making arguments for that?
We expect a decision by Tuesday. We will present our closing arguments, and then it'll be up to the presiding officer to advise us whether he is ready to provide that decision or not. But we expect that decision on Tuesday.
Just to maybe to speak also on your affidavit, you talked about in court your application to the Department of Home Affairs. Do you have a timeline on when they need to get back to you, or what are the procedures that you follow going forward in this particular application?
Yes, that is the application for asylum that Kemi Seba is making. There is administrative difficulties, and he needs to submit to the refugee center so that they can capture his biometric information. We have presented to the court that if he is released on bail, that he undertakes to report to the refugee center within 24 hours as a condition of his release on bail, so that he can present his biometrics and they can fully capture his application for asylum.
Earlier on during the proceedings, you explained in an affidavit by Mr. Kiba that the Niger's government is going to actually assist him in terms of confirmation of his address. Can you just tell us, walk us through that a little bit, the confirmation of address by the Niger embassy?
Yes, the Republic of Niger embassy has provided an undertaking to accommodate Kemi Seba at an embassy address here in Pretoria. So that documentation has been provided to the state to verify, and I believe that between now and then they will be conducting that verification of the address.
Welcome back to our show. My name is Seakga Tladi, and let's get into our next conversation. Let's talk a little bit about Zimbabwe, and particularly a very politically sensitive and historically loaded economic story emerging from Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe has announced that it's going to be returning 67 European-owned farms that were seized during Zimbabwe's somewhat controversial fast-track land reform program that was launched under the late former president Robert Mugabe in the early 2000s. At the same time, Zimbabwe was going to be paying about $146 million in compensation to foreign landowners protected under bilateral investment treaties. And this is coming as President Emmerson Mnangagwa is attempting to repair Zimbabwe's relationship with Western governments. It definitely seems like that's the case here, right? And this is to unlock debt relief for Zimbabwe and to bring Zimbabwe back into the global financial system after decades of isolation. Now, for me, where it becomes curious or where it becomes a bit weird is that it feels a little bit for me like Zimbabwe's hand is being twisted, right? It seems like Zimbabwe was isolated due to illegal sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe by Western governments. And those sanctions had their effects in destabilizing Zimbabwe, in acting as a blanket punishment on Zimbabwe, in acting as a blanket punishment on the entire SADC region. I mean, we've reported on the show about how detrimental the sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe are for the entire Southern African development community. And now it feels like those sanctions, they've simply just worked. It feels like those Western governments that played a part, let's say, at the very least, we can say they played a part. Those Western governments that played a part in sanctioning Zimbabwe, it seems like they've won. Right? But this is a story that is a lot more complex than the headline suggests. So when we hear about the return of the 67 farms, it's not just about that, right? Because many of the Western outlets, Reuters, for example, they're framing this as Zimbabwe correcting a mistake. But that narrative of Zimbabwe correcting a mistake ignores the colonial land theft that made land redistribution inevitable in the first place. The mistake didn't start in 2000 when black subsistence farmers took land back. And we'll have conversations. We can have conversations about how it's done. We can have conversations about the effectiveness of the method of the land redistribution in 2000. We can have that conversation. And I will accept all those criticisms of the fast track land reform program. But I do feel like we make a mistake when we frame this as, yeah, Zimbabwe is correcting what it did wrong, not acknowledging the colonial legacy that led to that. Right? I mean, I don't have to tell the story again. We know that before independence in 1980, a tiny white minority controlled the overwhelming majority of fertile land in Zimbabwe. And then you had millions of black Zimbabweans who were pushed into underdeveloped and overcrowded communal areas under the racist Rhodesian state led by Ian Smith. So this land issue was not just an economic issue, it was central to the liberation of Zimbabwe. It was central to Zimbabwe's sovereignty as well, and central to the dignity of Zimbabwean peoples. So we have to ask, was Zimbabwe right to pursue this radical land redistribution in 2000 when they did? And did the implementation failures of this fast-track land redistribution, was that a sort of tool that Western powers used as an economic weapon against Zimbabwe? And then finally, the question that we've got to ask ourselves is that, okay, so now Zimbabwe is coming to the table. Zimbabwe is talking about returning some of this land that was taken from European farmers and paying off the money, yada, 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 all of that, right? Does this deal, is this going to be the deal that helps to reset Zimbabwe's global economic relationships? Or is this going to be the deal that deepens Zimbabwe's dependency on the current global financial infrastructure, which includes the IMF and the World Bank, which we know have not been the fairest to African countries? So those are the three questions I want you to keep in mind as we talk about this now. But let's go back so we can understand the developments of today. Let's go back into history, right? So when Zimbabwe gained independence, like we've already said, the land ownership was very, very unequal, right? And the Lancaster Agreement was one of the agreements that facilitated Zimbabwe's independence. And there was provisions within the Lancaster House Agreement for a sort of land redistribution. But the progress on this land redistribution framework was slow. It was very slow. And many of those who fought for Zimbabwe's liberation, they felt betrayed. Rural communities remained dispossessed of land, dispossessed of wealth, and then resentment grew. Then we get to 2000, and Mugabe's government launches this fast-track land reform program. This is a program where the state encouraged occupations which targeted white-owned commercial farms, and they argue that this was necessary to sort of correct colonial injustice, right? And even to this day, there are many who feel that frustration, right? It remains a valid question even to this day. You know, just ask South Africa, where land ownership remains unequal to this day. Ask Namibia, ask Kenya. These are questions that we're still grappling with today. But I guess in Zimbabwe's case in 2000, and what is being contested now is the how. Is the how it was done. Was it right to encourage citizens to take this matter into their own hands? The how. And perhaps I can say that I do think it should have been a lot more systemic and top down rather than, you know, encouraging subsistence farmers to go on white-owned commercial farms and do as you please, right? But land injustice still remains one of Africa's unsolved colonial wounds. But this is where nuance matters, right? Because yes, Zimbabwe's land reform objectives may have been historically justified, but it's the execution. It's the violence. It's the how. And this caused the deterioration of investor confidence. And eventually, you know, it triggered a wider economic instability, which included the hyperinflation that we saw in Zimbabwe that peaked around 2008. Zimbabwe went from being viewed as an agricultural powerhouse to a country that was struggling with food insecurities. But I don't want us to act like the crisis was a crisis that Zimbabwe fostered on its own. We must remember the hand of the West, the sanctions, the unilaterally imposed sanctions that did not go through UN structures. So here's where the debate must get intensified, right? These sanctions played a very, very big role in destabilizing Zimbabwe as well. Sanctions often hurt the ordinary citizens far more than the political elites which they target. Hospitals suffer, employment declines, investment dries up because of these sanctions. And these sanctions are what caused the situation that we see in Zimbabwe today. It wasn't Zimbabwe's land reform program. It was the reaction to Zimbabwe's land reform program, which came in the form of unilaterally imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe. So now we need to get to the uncomfortable geopolitical question. Would I be right if I said that this move shows that the West is winning? Zimbabwe was, being pressured into reversing decisions it took in the interest of its own sovereignty, in the interest of providing land to its own people. This debt relief that Zimbabwe is seeking through some of these moves, is that just leverage that these Western countries can use? Are these financial institutions of the world, the IMF, the World Bank, are they being successful in dictating Zimbabwe's domestic policy? Right? Those concerns are not baseless. When a country owes so many billions of dollars and needs debt restructuring, then the people who are owed money, the creditors, they gain influence. That's how the global finance system works. We give you a loan and we gain influence in return. And this debt often reshapes sovereignty. So, is the West winning by getting this land back? Maybe you need to answer yourself that question as you are thinking about this. But there's also the other side, right? This may not be as simple as the West winning or Zimbabwe surrendering. But at the end of the day, Zimbabwe signed bilateral investment treaties. If you look up the story, that's what you keep hearing, that this is in line with the bilateral investment treaties that Zimbabwe made out of Zimbabwe's own volition. Zimbabwe made the deals, and those agreements created legal obligations. And if Zimbabwe wants international credibility, they have to respect the treaties that they sign. So this may not be as simple as just Zimbabwe surrendering. It may be that Zimbabwe is trying to show that it can correct its past excesses while preserving broader land reform gains. And this is perhaps what the media misses, right? One of the most overlooked details of the story is that this isn't only about white European farmers. So there are going to be black Zimbabwean farmers who also lost land during these seizures, and they are also getting their land back. So that's where the narrative changes significantly, because this shows that Zimbabwe is just trying to fix a procedural injustice. Zimbabwe is trying to correct the how of their land reform program and not necessarily reverse land reform itself. Zimbabwe is saying Zimbabwe is not saying that they don't need land reform, but they're just being honest about the mistakes of how the land reform took place. And that is something very different from thinking that no, the West is just one. And then we have to get to the irony here, because for me, it's so crazy. It's so crazy that a small economy, a small African country, maybe not small in size, Zimbabwe is pretty big, but small in economy and small in political influence, right? That small nation of Zimbabwe is publicly acknowledging wrongful seizures and trying to compensate individuals. So this small African country has got the maturity to take that step. And at the same time, at the exact same time, many of the former colonial powers who imposed their will on African countries during the time of colonialism, many of those powers, they still refuse to fully address historical land theft, reparations for slavery, or other colonial crimes. Let's think about that irony for a second. An African country that has been the victim of colonial injustice is correcting its own wrongful seizures of land before even a lot of the colonial powers do that. I mean, the United Kingdom still faces calls over colonial reparations. France faces scrutiny in West Africa. Belgium continues to confront the legacy of atrocities in the DRC. So perhaps there's a lesson here for a lot of these Western countries. And the lesson is that Zimbabwe is showing that accountability is possible. You can take accountability for your perceived wrongdoings, even when it is politically difficult. Because it will be politically difficult. I mean, at the end of the day, there are people that are on that land that is being used or that is being returned to the European farmers. There are Africans that are on that land and they'll have to go somewhere else now. So it's a tough call that the Zimbabwean government made. A tough call. And all of these decisions in Zimbabwe have never been simple, right? There's a lot of interconnecting threads that we've got to think about. Colonial history, our own sovereignty, land justice, economic freedom for African peoples, global power networks which are able to leverage debt and twist the arms of countries. There's a lot of interconnecting strands here. The original grievance which led to these seizures of land that Zimbabwe is now trying to correct, the original grievance was real. Maybe the execution was flawed, okay. And the debate about sanctions, that was also flawed in my opinion. That should have been at least a multilateral move. But despite all of that complication and nuance, it appears as though Zimbabwe is taking the initiative and trying to chart a new path. A path that says that we will defend historical justice and will also engage the rest of the world, right? But now the question is, are the Western governments, is the international community going to meet Zimbabwe halfway? Right? Are we going to start forming partnerships with Zimbabwe now because of the goodwill that Zimbabwe has shown to these countries? So Zimbabwe's next chapter is going to be an interesting one. And we're going to be keeping an eye on it right here on this show. But right now, I want us to unpack this a little bit more with an economist who's coming from Zimbabwe. His name is Mr. Malone Gwadu, and he has spoken to us on the show before. It's always a fun time to have him. So please, without any further ado, help me welcome him onto the show. This is Malone Gwadu. We've got a very interesting story to talk about here today, with Zimbabwe announcing the return of 67 European-owned farms and also paying a sum of money in compensation rather, as well. So I wanted to bring you on to speak about the significance of this shift from the perspective of Zimbabwean people. So maybe let's start there. We'll set up the context. You know, obviously I've already said about the European-owned farms that are being returned. And I think the compensation is $146 million, which is being paid to these European farmers as well. And this is tied to bilateral investment treaties after a long debate in Zimbabwe and about Zimbabwe regarding land reform tensions. So within that context, what does this mean for the people of Zimbabwe?
Well, look, I think it's quite important to underscore that the farms that are being returned are as a result of bilateral agreements that were set and were prevalent and backdated to the times when there was the land reform program. So there was need for there to be restitution and, most importantly, respect for property rights that has been under contest. And now that there's been realization that, look, these farms need to be returned to the respective countries, particularly in Europe, that were rightfully entitled to occupy and use these farms. It's a step in the right direction by and large, in the sense that it's a signal that Zimbabwe has respect for property rights, and it assures investors that there's a different approach with regards to how Zimbabwe now handles issues to do with land in a way that is more diplomatic, that is more consultative, that is more inclusive, and most importantly, that has got dialogue involved in it, with a view of ensuring that there's no prejudice from one party to the other.
Would you say that this is one of the most significant steps in Zimbabwe's efforts to sort of reestablish itself in a stronger way in the international order?
Well, I think the first step was the global compensation, treaty, where Zimbabwe acknowledged the need for compensation for farmers for the improvements some years back, and now this is another step in ensuring that there is, uniformity with regards to our land reform program and addressing the historical challenges that have been there and that have caused there to be an albatross on any other economic endeavor that Zimbabwe may pursue, you will be aware that this is a key aspect that has been set for, debt reform and debt resolution framework for Zimbabwe. So this is a way of ensuring that we unlock a certain levers that we want to achieve by ensuring that the global compensation agreement is honored, and the restitution of farms that were that are protected under the bilateral agreements are returned to the farms, and we signal the intended signal of respect for property rights and ensuring that investors become confident, and even our debt handlers see that sign of intent and goodwill for Zimbabwe to take the necessary step in the different economic discourse that we're currently occupying as a country.
I mean, when I look at this, it sort of shows me something different from a lot of the very simplistic conversations that I had about land reform. Often when people think or talk about land reform, it's about Africans taking land and all of those very simple conversations. But it shows nuance in a way. It shows that the conversation of land reform is fluid, and it's about looking at what needs to be done for the country as a whole. Would you think I'm correct in that sort of assessment?
Yeah, rightfully so, in the sense that the land issue is not, in isolation. It's got implications beyond the land reform and the land, restitution and, the land redistribution program that was there. It has got implications beyond land, such as, like I mentioned earlier, the debt resolution. So fluid, as you mentioned, but it's got implications beyond the land reform and the historical injustice that was intended to be addressed, without sounding obviously too political. But it was a necessary step towards ensuring that while this aspect needed to be addressed, we don't lose the overarching economic policy that Zimbabwe holds of respect for property rights and ensuring that investors don't lose confidence in terms of potentially losing their assets in our country as then they want to invest.
Mm. But I'm also still curious to think about the farmers, the regular Zimbabweans. For them, does this not in some way indicate a loss for them? How would you assess this for the ordinary everyday Zimbabwean?
Well, the current occupants of the land that is now being restituted, obviously, it will be a loss for them in the sense that it's not being returned to the rightful owners of this land as the government's position. But the medium to long term is supposed to serve the ordinary Zimbabwean by ensuring that Zimbabwe's positioning in the international community is enhanced through it signaling that it respects its mistakes if it made any, and it's also restituting and compensating its past injustices which it will have undertaken. So in the short term, obviously, this return will probably cause for discomfort for the ordinary Zimbabwean, particularly those that were in the actual farms. But in the medium to long term, with the overarching intention of ensuring that Zimbabwe's position is better and being largely, if I may call it, compliant with a key aspect of the debt reform and debt resolution dialogue, it's a step in the right direction.
Mm. So it's almost a long-term and systemic solution, even though it might cause some short-term implications that, like a lot of political moves, will be uncomfortable for some in the population.
Absolutely, because this is a very heated subject that is not easy to dissect and decipher without tiptoeing into the political undertones and underpinnings. But holding the purely economic implications of this is that respect for property rights is enhanced. Debt resolution framework in terms of what we need to achieve, we are gradually building towards that. And I think investor confidence also and investor assurance, this particular action acts to positively influence that.
Now, we know that Zimbabwe has put some efforts forward in terms of aligning itself very closely with BRICS. And Russia and China had backed some of the original reforms aimed at restoring the dignity of African people in Zimbabwe. So how might this bode for Zimbabwe's move towards joining BRICS?
Uh, Joining BRICS is the key aspect of obviously Zimbabwe's political and economic trajectory. So the fact that there's respect for bilateral, trilateral, multilateral agreements speaks to BRICS' confidence of Zimbabwe honoring its end of the bargain in terms of agreements. Because while the bilateral agreements are not necessarily related to BRICS countries, it's got implications on the agreements that they'll have and Zimbabwe's ability to honor these agreements under the BRICS framework. So it enhances Zimbabwe's competitiveness and ability to be able to be admitted into the BRICS and enjoy the benefits that come and the responsibilities that come as well with being part of the BRICS community.
So it's in many ways about demonstrating Zimbabwe's commitment to its word. When Zimbabwe says it will do this, it follows through on those actions, and that sort of reliability is key, whether this is about BRICS or about some of those countries where the farmers are coming from, like the UK and Netherlands and Germany and the former Yugoslavia.
Exactly. It's all about credibility and the confidence that whichever counterparty we enter into agreements with, they will have the confidence that Zimbabwe will honor its part of the bargain in any agreement.
And now, what would you say other African nations can learn from moves like this?
Well, Zimbabwe has demonstrated, like I mentioned earlier, its credibility and its ability to address its challenges and its mistakes and its historical injustices. So I think other African nations ought to also probably take a leaf in terms of ensuring that when there's a need for restitution and when there's need for historical, problems and inaction that caused prejudice, there's need for that to be addressed, so that we reset our global economic positioning. You'll be aware that Africa is Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, where Zimbabwe, the African continent, is gradually moving towards the trading zone. So there's need for us to align in terms of our thoughts and our actions in a way that ensures that there's uniform confidence and assurance to the international community.
And then maybe there's also lessons to be found here for some of those countries in the West, where conversations about reparations and restitution is still happening. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit of what some of these Western countries can learn from Zimbabwe's move as well?
Well, look, when there's a claim for prejudice from a sovereign state to the next, where there's a problem or an injustice has occurred, there's this need for restitution and compensation. Zimbabwe is a relatively smaller country as compared to the countries that we're compensating to, but it's a sign of goodwill of Zimbabwe to be able to acknowledge that we need to address this issue, despite the relatively wealthier positions that they occupy in the international community as compared to us. So in the same way, we would also want to probably appeal for there to be reciprocal approach to African states whenever there's need for there to be compensation of any kind to African states.
Yeah, I mean, it's about showing that goodwill back, the same goodwill that Zimbabwe is showing. A lot of the African continent needs to be shown it back. My final question, Mr. Gwadu, is about what are your hopes for this in terms of resetting Harare's global economic ties?
My hope is that this compensation will act as a show of commitment and as a show of good faith and goodwill from Harare to the international partners. And these particular countries which we are compensating are key decision makers for our debt resolution and debt reform framework, which we are currently under negotiations with them. So we hope that this will play a significant part in terms of, the proposals which are being put forward by the relative Harare authorities within the fiscal front with regards to debt restructuring and debt forgiveness and debt bridge finance, so to say, to ensure that Zimbabwe unlocks its true economic potential, and that there will be goodwill and credibility for Zimbabwe to honor its debt commitments that we have agreed to in the medium to long term for the development of Zimbabwe and Africa at large.
All right. No, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I think this is a very, very interesting thing that is going on. And indeed, a lot of these countries in the West who are being compensated by Zimbabwe, I think they've got a lot to learn from Zimbabwe as well. So I'm very complimentary in that regard. So thank you so much for joining me. Welcome back to the show. We're going to keep it moving along swiftly. We've just been listening to Malone Gwadu speaking about the situation in Zimbabwe. And now we are going to move on, bring it right back here to South Africa, and particularly to South African townships. So today is International Nurses Day. Nurses Day gets celebrated on May the 12th, which is the birthday of Florence Nightingale, one of the pioneers of nursing. And the theme for this year's Nursing Day is Our Nurses, Our Future. Empowered nurses save lives. And that theme is especially relevant here in South Africa because nurses have been the backbone of our country's healthcare system for a long time. But a new model is quietly emerging that could reshape our healthcare system and provide poor people, the many, many poor people that are in South Africa, with some assistance and delivery of healthcare. So across townships like Tembisa, Diepsloot, Soweto, there are clinics that are popping up. And these clinics are not just treating patients, but they're turning nurses into entrepreneurs, and they're creating jobs as well. And they're also reducing pressure on overcrowded state hospitals. These are called empathy clinics. It's the empathy clinic model, and it is supported by Riza Babuyile and led by Riza Ventures. And they operate clinics in multiple township communities where, the healthcare system can be very much overburdened and people are standing in line for hours and hours. So this is a critical conversation because, health is life, right? We don't have a society if we don't have health. So we need to ask ourselves, how can these nurse-led township clinics help to democratize healthcare access? And we're also going to be talking about, how they can strengthen South Africa's national health insurance ambitions as well. So let's begin with the reality of the healthcare system in South Africa. For many South Africans, accessing healthcare remains a very, very frustrating experience. I can share with you, I have a partner and we were chilling one night together and accidentally she spilled boiling hot water on herself. And after spilling boiling hot water on herself, she had to obviously be rushed to hospital. She had third-degree burns. It was crazy. But before going to hospital, we had to wait and think for a second about, do we really want to go to a public hospital? And the reason why we really had to think about that is because sometimes it's not a nice experience going to public hospitals. You can wait in long queues. Some people arrive before the sun rises and then they leave late in the afternoon. You can spend the entire day there. Sometimes medicines can be unavailable. Sometimes staffing shortages can mean delayed care. And for working class South Africans, missing an entire day of work to sit in a queue, that can be financially devastating. And this is especially true in townships where communities are suffering with a healthcare infrastructure that has historically lagged behind wealthier suburbs. And this imbalance in the healthcare systems of South Africa is not an accident. It's a result of apartheid era spatial planning. And it is a reflection of the broader inequality that still exists in South Africa to this day. So, what is being done about this? What can get done about this? Well, instead of waiting for new big hospitals to be built, some organizations are trying to decentralize the healthcare industry. And this empathy model allows nurses to own and operate clinics in their own communities. And that is a very simple but sophisticated development, because nurses, they understand the community. Nurses understand the communities that they live in better than, a doctor that is sitting in a fancy office or a policymaker that is sitting in a fancy office. Nurses who live in the community know the common illnesses there. They know what sort of challenges are being faced. They know the chronic disease trends of the place. They know the barriers which residents of the community face. And quite importantly, they're also trusted, right? So these empathy clinics currently operate in at least 11 township communities. And this includes area where private healthcare has been inaccessible traditionally. And these clinics are intentionally positioned as affordable alternatives. They're significantly cheaper than many traditional private healthcare options. And this is incredibly important. Healthcare shouldn't cost anything. And at the very least, healthcare shouldn't be as expensive as it is. The rich shouldn't have a separate and better healthcare system than the poor. That is not freedom. And South Africa's government has tried to pursue solutions to this through a national health insurance, which is called the NHI. So they want a healthcare model where access to healthcare is dictated by the need and not by income. I remember when they announced the national health insurance in South Africa, there was almost an uproar, right? There was people saying that, no, our government doesn't have the infrastructure. Our government doesn't have the capacity to provide healthcare for everyone. There was people saying, oh, how are they going to get the funding for this? They're going to tax the rich again. Private healthcare groups, they were talking about the disruption to them. So there were a lot of concerns. But what if this nurse-led clinic model is one of the practical solutions, one of the practical middle grounds, right? Because any sort of national health insurance, it's going to need a strong primary healthcare system. So this means that we shouldn't end up going to hospitals for minor illnesses. It's inefficient and it's also expensive. So the rise of these community clinics can be maybe like a frontline healthcare hubs where preventative measures can be taken, where chronic illnesses can be treated consistently, where maternal health can be looked after, preventative care, early diagnosis, HIV treatment, because we know HIV is a massive problem in South Africa. Vaccinations. We don't need to go to big hospitals for all of these things. These are things that nurses are able to do. And this is where the costs are also low and the outcomes are very strong. So it doesn't cost much to do preventative medicine. It doesn't cost much to make sure your HIV treatment is kept up with. These are cheap. But the health outcomes are very, very strong. Although it doesn't cost much to maintain your HIV treatment, if you do it well, then you can live a long and fruitful life even with HIV. So this is one of it. All of those people who are concerned about the national health insurance and who have doubts about it, you are the people who should be supporting these nurse-led clinics. And then let's also think about the economic side of it, right? This model is encouraging entrepreneurship, healthcare entrepreneurship. So, how important is it to be creating Black-owned healthcare infrastructures, Black-owned clinics that will be able to employ people, that will also be able to help people? And I mean, there's industries that can start around the clinics as well. People will sell food outside the clinics. People will sell snacks outside the clinics. So business breeds more business. This creates jobs for nurses, jobs for administrators, community healthcare workers. Every time we open a new one of these clinics, that's a whole bunch of more people who are being employed. That is more money in more pockets. But we have to be realistic as well. There's challenges. And these challenges, our job now and the job of our leadership now is to confront every single one of them and make it easier for these nurses to run these businesses. So this is a profound development. It's a profound development for me because during apartheid, Black communities were systematically denied quality healthcare and infrastructure. And back then, Black nurses often held these communities together. I mean, we can think about people like Doranginza, who built healthcare networks in underserved Black communities way before government prioritized them. So in many ways, this nurse-led township clinic model, it continues that tradition, that legacy, that building our healthcare system from the ground up in our communities. That's what's going on here. And joining us to unpack this model is someone who is working every single day to support it. Her name is Linda Dunkley of Riser Ventures, and she's going to be joining us to discuss how this model can become a major pillar of South Africa's healthcare future. So please help me welcome onto the show, Linda Dunkley. I wanted to bring you on to talk a little bit about Nurses Day and some of the work that's going on around all of that. So thank you for joining me.
Perfect, and thank you very much for having me today. I think it's an important conversation to be had.
Of course. Now, we are celebrating International Nurses Day with the theme Empowered Nurses Save Lives. How is Riser Ventures empowering nurses and as entrepreneurs in township clinics? And can you maybe speak to the significance of these township clinics as well?
Perfect. So I think that the theme couldn't be more aligned with what we are building. Through our empathy clinics, we are creating a pathway for our nurses to transition from being employees within an overburdened system to becoming owners and leaders in their own communities. So what we are doing is we provide the infrastructure, the business support, the frameworks, and the nurse is bringing her clinical experience and the community trust. What we're finding is that a nurse who owns her clinic and everything that she touches, it is the catalyst to change everything. So the quality of care is improving, the patient relationship is deepening, and the nurse herself is invested in a fundamentally different way. She now has ownership. She's not just employed. So we call them specifically nursepreneurs, and they represent for us really the future of primary healthcare in South Africa. Our model doesn't just empower our individual nurses, it builds community-owned health infrastructure that is sustainable and self-reliant.
And can I ask what inspired this, or where does this come from, these empathy clinics? Can you maybe take me back to the origins?
Yeah, so I think We have a systemic problem with healthcare in general, and we want to partner with government to alleviate the pressure they are feeling in the public hospitals. There has to be a greater solution, and it requires collaboration from all parties, from private sector, from donors, from government, and right down to the nurses themselves, in order to create something that is more sustainable and that can really serve the people. So I think we looked at the pressures that our public healthcare facilities were facing, and we're trying to put a solution on the table that allows us to move forwards in a sustainable way.
And that solution was these empathy clinics, an innovative solution, indeed. Because, like you do say, there is the problem of the overburdened healthcare systems, with some of the hospitals having so many people visiting all the time. So, is there any early data from your ventures that highlights the impact on patient outcomes when these empathy clinics are used?
Yeah. So I think we're still in the early stages, and where you start collecting data and really being able to tell the story. But what I can say right now is that patients are returning consistently. We've got a high retention rate. Chronic conditions are being managed more regularly, which is also very, very important. And the feedback from communities is that access has fundamentally improved. So I think that when that speaks to preventative and getting out in front of something, early detection before it becomes a crisis, is what we are managing to ensure and to help with.
Yeah, I mean, some of the more successful health systems in the world, I mean, we hear about Cuba all the time, and they've got a very strong preventative medicine framework. So, in what ways does this contribute to the sort of preventative medicine so that it doesn't have to go down the line and become something much worse?
Absolutely. I think that is fundamentally at our core. And why we believe in focusing on primary health care, because if you are addressing things early on and focused on primary health care, and you're not waiting in the clinics for very long waited times, your nurse is familiar to you, your nurse knows you, she's treating you as a patient, not just another patient in a long line of patients that she needs to see. I think that nuances will be able to be detected. There's a better relationship involved with our nurse and our patient, and that speaks to being able to get out in front, to pre-treat, to prevent crises from happening, and really have a hospital visit be our last option. And I think also, if you talk about chronic medication management, regular visits, where it doesn't interrupt your everyday life, where your working life, you can still go to work, and that you can collect this medication, you can engage with your nurse, who is from your community, who understands the challenges you face, is powerful. And it's our solution.
Yeah, and I wanted to find out about how areas are being chosen for these empathy clinics. Is there any sort of system to sort of decide, okay, this area is particularly overburdened in its medical system, so we should go to that area? How is it decided?
So we work very closely and we partner with the Department of Health. And I think that is a vital relationship, to the success of anything that we roll out. And so we work together with them to identify where they are seeing the biggest need, where they are seeing the communities are being currently underserved, and we make recommendations for sites in coordination with them. And that is how we position ourselves. So very much partnership with Department of Health.
Yeah, that's actually one of the questions I wanted to ask, is that in what ways do these clinics line up with government goals, or are there any particular goals that are being targeted?
There are definitely goals, and I think that's we are the Department of Health's partner. So when they want to be speaking about men's health, and that definitely speaks to a different level of care or a different approach to care. We are directly engaging with them. Where are they seeing their most need? How can we mobilize our clinics on the ground to facilitate with getting care to the people? So decentralizing the health space, creating a safe environment for our patients to connect with, and to achieve overall, what South Africa needs from a healthcare system.
Yeah, and there's also the problem of, we've already spoken about the overstretched healthcare system, but nurse shortages are also a very, very big problem, reaching into the tens of thousands
Yeah.
last year. So in
Yeah.
what ways does this address that sort of gap?
Yeah, so I agree with you. The nurse shortage is definitely, it is alarming when you look at it as a number. And I think that it is reflecting a system that's under genuine crisis. But I also feel that it points to something important. The solution cannot simply be to recruit more nurses into the same failing infrastructure. We need new models of care delivery that make better use of the nursing capacity that we have. And that is what these township clinics can do. We deploy the nurses in settings where they can practice at the top of their field. They build those long-term relationships with our patients, and we deliver care that is genuinely patient-centered, something that is quite difficult to achieve in an overcrowded public facility. So when the nurse runs her own clinic in her own community, she isn't just filling a gap. We haven't just put a placeholder there. She is building something durable. And I think the model of care that emerges, which is preventative, relational, community embedded, is precisely what a self-reliant primary healthcare system should look like.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to put a name to it, I would even maybe go and call it Ubuntu healthcare. That's
Yes.
an interesting way to think about it as well. But we also have to think about the financial side, or maybe the policy side, because are there any sort of funding or policy changes that are needed from government to help to support this sort of model?
Yeah, I think that what is starting to change the game is the broader NHI policy direction. I think the political commitment to providing universal healthcare has created a receptive environment for conversations about alternate delivery models to start taking place. But I think we're in a long way, from seeing actual physical tax incentives and things. If I could put something on the table that I believe would be game changing, I think policies such as tax relief for clinic operators in underserved areas, or streamlined licensing for nurse-run facilities, direct contracting under NHI, I think those could be game changing in the future, of where we sit.
Yeah, and also we've still got to think about, in those circumstances where we do need further healthcare, because I mean, I know that nurses are amazing and they can treat an entire range of ailments, but there is a scope of practice. So, for example, I don't think nurses are allowed to diagnose or to take any decisions like that. So, what sort of network or infrastructure is needed so that these clinics, these empathy clinics, are connected
Yeah,
to a bigger network as well of hospitals,
agreed.
doctors?
Agreed. Definitely. The current scope of practice definitely puts regulations and places meaningful constraints on what our nurses can do independently, just as you've spoken about prescribing and in diagnosis, there are barriers. And I think our model currently operates in the existing regulatory framework. Compliance is completely non-negotiable. We run an ideal clinic model. But we do believe that that an evidence-based review of the scope of practice is overdue. And, countries across the world have expanded the scope as, the health system evolves. And I think that we need, as South Africa, as a country, we need to have that conversation urgently. And I think it needs to be led by evidence. The nursing profession itself needs to be represented, and an honest assessment of what the population actually needs also needs to be presented, and a new revision and a way forward decided on.
That is very, very interesting. I was not aware about the increased scope of practice in some other countries. Do you maybe have some examples of that kind of thing?
So there are some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So we are currently expanding our footprint into East Africa. And when we are engaging with the nurses in those countries, we are finding differences in the scope of practice. And I think that it's something, as a country for us to start collaborating on.
Yeah, and especially in an evidence-based manner, like you say.
Yes.
Because if it's found to have been successful in East Africa, for example, then I don't see why a similar kind of thing can be applied in South Africa. And also, this seems to be a particularly powerful chance for women empowerment as well. I mean, our president has been speaking a lot about empowering women and small businesses. And because, women make up a massive, massive percentage of nurses, it almost kills two birds with the same stone.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that women, 90% of South Africans nurses, I think, if we look at the statistics, are women. And these are women who have dedicated their careers to looking after others, to caring for others, sometimes at significant personal cost, at cost of their own families. And, they've also historically had very limited pathways to economic ownership or leadership in their communities. And, the nursepreneur model changes that. It really does. When the nurse owns her clinic, she's not just the caregiver. She's an employer, she's a business owner, and she's a community anchor. And those changes, are absolutely important in a systemic change. She's building, generational wealth, not just earning a salary. And I think in the context of, South Africa's gender inequality and our economic exclusion, that is profoundly significant. I think it also extends beyond the nurse herself. A woman-owned business in a township community has ripple effects. It employs people, it models possibility, for our youth that are coming up. And it really does shift how a community sees itself. And I think on International Nurses Day, this is particularly relevant.
All right. Welcome back to our show. We're going to keep it moving right along. Now we're going to be talking about our SADC region as the final story, as the final conversation we're going to be having about. And really the question is SADC ready to turn these global trade tensions that we see in the world into a new regional industrial growth era? How can, as a SADC community, we use everything that's going on now to better ourselves? So in this conversation that one of our correspondents, Mr. Pieter Kriel, he put this interview together with Ashraf Patel. He's a senior research associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. And they were discussing how South Africa can use the momentum of our G20 presidency to push for stronger SADC industrial leadership ahead of the summit, which is coming up in August. This includes many, many factors, and I'm not going to spend much time preaching to you about it. I would rather let Peter and Mr. Ashraf Patel tell the story through their interview. So please, let's get ready to listen to this interview between Pieter Kriel and Mr. Ashraf Patel.
Following South Africa's G20 presidency, how can South Africa help carry forward the development of industrialization and global South priorities that is championed in the SADC regional agenda?
Yes, South Africa's G20 presidency had a wide-ranging themes, but one of the pillars was green industrialization. And under that theme, uh, and you must note that it was marketed as Africa's G20, being the first time hosted on the African continent. And so the green industrialization agenda has been gaining momentum alongside what is called the new quest for critical minerals on the African continent. Therein lays the challenge. On the one hand, the quest for critical minerals is caught up in the geopolitics, US, China, EU, etc. And in that milieu, South Africa and the Africa Union is pushing for the kind of Africa mining vision. We call it the Africa Mining and Industrialization Strategy, spearheaded by the Africa Union and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. So that is the linchpin of the plan. And of course, they envisage the regional economic communities, the RECs, to kind of implement at the sub-regional level. And therefore, we have what is called in SADC, the SADC Regional Indicative Industrialization Plan. Now, that has been on the planning for 10 years, but very little kind of transport and economic industrial integration. So that is a huge gap for the SADC region at this point in time.
We've seen a very big influx in global trade wars, disrupting supply chains, as well as placing huge, tremendous pressure on developing economies. Do you think SADC can use this moment to build a more self-sustaining regional economy that relies less on Western markets?
Look, it has no choice. We are in a multiple crisis since the beginning of 2026. We have a global energy crisis, and remember the war in the Middle East is affecting the globe on a high cost of living crisis platform. But Africa suffers more because it also has the high cost of debt. And as crises increase, it has to borrow more on international markets, making cost of capital more expensive. On top of that, we have the fertilizer issue, meaning Africa is not self-sufficient in fertilizer. It imports from the region, and the Strait of Hormuz closure has affected fertilizer and food production. So we're in a multiple crisis. SADC has to respond. Unfortunately, it's each state on its own. You have Angola and Mozambique seeing the opportunity and moving towards oil exploration. And of course, they would do quite well there. But then what happens to the other countries that are getting left behind? South Africa lacks the refining capacity. Botswana cannot balance its budgets because of lab-grown diamonds. And then we have Lesotho that faces the Trump tariffs on textiles with thousands of job losses. So, they have to work in unison, and they need a regional industrial development plan.
There are growing discussions around SADC trade and development and the Fusion Fund. If you could explain this to me simply, how could such a mechanism protect vulnerable economies while also strengthening the regional trade and the production and so forth?
Yes, good question. I kind of drew upon the experience in Asia, the Asian nations during the COVID crisis and the kind of economic crises. They have set a financing facility in which the poorer Asian nations can draw from the facility, the financing facility, if there is disruption in global markets. So, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, they have used that facility. And I think SADC should set up a similar facility. Nations that are undergoing tariff challenges with the Trump administration, etc., can use that facility so they don't have to borrow from international markets, which is expensive. Secondly, they can trade in parallel currencies or in their own currencies, and that would assist in a level of de-dollarization that could assist SADC to become a solid bloc. And, if it can start with a parallel currency, that could be a building block for its own regional currency in few years' time.
What role do you think South Africa can play in helping SADC move from just exporting raw materials to actually processing resources, creating factories and jobs through doing that?
Yes, look, South Africa is an economic leader. 60 to 70% of the SADC GDP is within South Africa. It is the leader in research and development. It has major multinational corporations. It has a national system of innovation. It has institutions like the CSIR, as well as Mintech for minerals processing. It can assist in some level of technical transfer to the SADC nations so that they could begin to beneficiate. It could get its mining companies to be more responsible corporate citizens in Africa, to be less extractive, but also to focus more on environment, social, and governance indicators. So it can play a moral role, a economic stewardship role that is much more responsible going forward.
As SADC prepares for the summit in August of 2026, how could a bold and successful regional industrial agenda look like in the face of all the recent global wars and disruptions in the chains and all of that?
Yes, remember industrialization it's a cross-cutting across sectors. So it can start with agricultural better technologies for the poorer countries in industrialized agriculture, so that it needs to prevent dumping of agri-goods. That's the first challenge. Or secondly, it can promote value added in both agriculture and mining in SADC countries. And thirdly, better human capital development. So to upgrade the universities in developing new training programs in kind of manufacturing and engineering and mining production, and that can assist new companies to emerge that can kind of develop linkages between the mining companies and the kind of corporates for intermediate goods. Intermediate goods is what made Germany and China very successful, because they managed to create very competent companies that developed intermediate goods. That could be one area that they could work on.
All right, that is it for our show today. It has been an absolutely jam-packed show. We've spoken about a whole lot of things, from the SADC region to nurse and community-led healthcare in South Africa. We spoke a little bit about the Kemi Seba case, which we're going to keep updating you on. And we spoke a little bit about Zimbabwe taking a bold decision to return farmland to European farmers. So it has been a very, very full one, but it does come to an end. That's everything I have for you. Until next time, I have been Seakga Tladi, and I am out of here.